very, very well-known personality in our Indic circle, and he has already given many talks at our platform. First of all, I would request all of you to switch on your radios if possible, because that will help us have a more lively interaction with Bharat Gupji. And I think many of us are already fans of Bharat Gupji, so we definitely don't need any introduction to Bharat Gupji. And especially that he's already, done so many. I mean, he's one of the few people who actually done live sessions and asked me anything. And I really like this kind of interaction because it is so informal. And I think Bharat Gupji is one of the few people who has this sort of courage to, answer anything on any question. And he has this, like, you can ask me anything and, I can answer anything. So I think it's a very rare opportunity for us as students and as fans of scholars to ask anything that we want without any hesitation. So I would like to thank Bharat Gupji again for coming and speaking on our platform, and I welcome him again on our platform. And I'm glad that we are having these night sessions where we can ask anything we want. On today's topic is Ask Anything on Varna, and I think this is very important, especially because Varna is a term which is grossly misunderstood and also misrepresented in academic circles especially. And also there is a lot of confusion about caste and about jati and Varna. And I think this is a weak point for most Hindus, because a lot of Westerners accuse Hinduism of having caste system, and this is something that most Hindus feel hard to defend, when they're accused of, because they can often defend other things, but when they say caste system, they say, maybe we have this. So I think this is an important point, because if you understand the concept of Varna properly, you can defend yourself, I think, very well, intellectually, I mean. So I think with these words, I welcome again Bharat Gupji, who is a very learned scholar, and he's a retired professor from Delhi University, and he has written widely on aesthetics, on Natya Shastra. He's also recorded a course with us on Natya Shastra, and you can also view that course on our website. And with these words, I again welcome the audience, and I request you to switch on your cameras, whosoever can, and you can ask Bharat Gupji anything today on Varna. Thank you.
And our request is specifically on Varna, not anything else, because with the fruitful discussion, we can keep it related to Jati, Varna and caste. Sir, you're welcome.
Shri Gurubhyo Namah. I am very happy to be with you all here, and people who have come on my special request like Sahana and Oindrila and others. And I'm sure there are many more faces that I can't see, but during the course of the discussion now, I will interact with you all, and I would speak specifically on the problem as it exists, not so much within India, of course it does, about how to deal with Varna Jati and the so-called caste system, but specifically on the international scene which is being generated. You see, so this is very important. And as some people have pointed out to me, that what is happening in America and England, that is an attempt to make law against caste discrimination. They are trying to bring it into the legal system in UK as well as in America at some point, not very far. But the whole exercise is actually aimed at bringing a law in the Indian Parliament, because the great damage would be done if a law under the guise of eliminating caste discrimination is brought in the Indian Parliament, and then this law is misused in order to create all kinds of dissensions and cases just at the fall of a hat, that kind of a situation. Because that seems to me to be the long time political plan. Anyway, how to fight it, that's what I am going to discuss with you and tell you what I have thought about it, and of course you will think and we'll work out and contribute our ideas to the general pool of Indians, Hindus in US and Canada and England and Europe, as well as in India, as to how to resist this kind of a machination. Now, there are usually two positions taken on this issue of Varna or Varna Jati or Varna Ashram Dharma, as it is traditionally called. You see, traditionally in the Smritis, it is categorized and named as Varna Ashram Dharma. So Manusmriti, Yagyavalkya Smriti, Apastam Griha Sutra, all these texts, they classify this as Varna Ashram Dharma. They do not talk about jatis specifically because they presume that jatis are professional guilds which are there because of an economy, and there are hundreds and hundreds of it according to the economy in different parts of India, and it is the jati which allows a person to pursue a particular activity, a karma, a profession, an ajivika according to his or her birth as well as her training. So this was the broad thing. And then the jatis, they wanted to place themselves in the category of one of the four varnas. Now obviously in all the smritis, in the classification of varna, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, it was also said that look, these are the activities or professional jobs or ajivikas or guna karma of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, etc. Broadly speaking, those involved with knowledge, teaching, preservation of knowledge, writing, manuscript, this, that, would be Brahmins. Those who would administer, Kshatriyas, those who would make money and do commerce would be Vaishyas, and those who would be in the serving class. Serving in the sense, those who would be doing more of repetitive mechanical jobs which are not mechanical in the sense of a machine, because there was no machine in those times, but through hands, manual. However, whatever you do with hand is not without mind, it's not without creativity. It was a job which was done as a shilpa or as a skill, and there were various categories of people among the Shudras, from very ordinary skilled or ordinarily skilled people to highly skilled people and artistic people and very creative people. So this was the classification, and at the same time there was all the time a movement up and down. You see, sometimes if a Brahmin was not able to get proper education, or he just didn't want to do it as a matter of his choice, then he would take to another profession. He would take to a profession which would bring him close to the Kshatriya. Like Drona. Drona learned how to wield arms. Now once he became professional in wielding arms, he would of course not keep company of the Brahmins. He'll keep company of the Kshatriyas. He'll teach them. He would be a teacher. And then his job would touch both the Varnas, because he would become part of the administration, part of the hierarchy of Kshatriyahood, and he would of course be a warrior like any other warrior, Kshatriya warrior. At the same time, personally, he would continue with his Kula Dharma, his practices, his vows and rituals as a Brahmin. So you see, life for Drona was both. It was the life of a Kshatriya as well as the life of a Brahmin. Brahmin in the sense that he was a teacher, Kshatriya that he was a fighter also. It's not as if Drona said, okay, I have given you the education to fight, so now I have nothing else to do. So let the Pandavas and Kauravas fight. No, he was himself a fighter. He was a great general. So let us remember that there were innumerable cases like this, because these things were not watertight. Now what has happened is that in India today, some people take a very rigid view. You know, like our great scholar for whom I have utmost respect, like the Shankaracharya of Puri, Nishchalanand Swamiji. He says that if you are born into a Varna, a Kshatriya or a Vaishya or a Shudra or whatever, then you should only follow the profession, the karmas as are prescribed in the Smritis. And of course these Smritis are 2000 years old and they have a certain economy of the time. So he says that that is your nature, that is what you are supposed to do. Because of prarabdha karma, you have come into that particular kul, Brahman kul or Kshatriya kul, and that is what you should do. You should not do something else. However, if you have to do, you may do it either as a choice or as a departure, but ideally you should do that and that only. Now this is a very rigid view because to my mind, somehow it does not fully take into account the doctrine of karma. You see, every Indian philosophy is based upon the concept of karma. So it is because of Purva Janma karma, prarabdha, that one gets birth in either of the four varnas. But then your past alone is not your sanchit karma or your collected karma. You have a present and a future. And that present and the future does not bind you entirely to the past. So if I am born in one particular varna, I don't want to continue in that profession, then I should have the choice, and people had the choice, and people went in for different professions. For instance, in the play Mritya-Katikam, we see Charudat, who is a Brahmin by birth, but who becomes a businessman. So there are umpteen number of cases and umpteen number of instances. So this concept that Varna meant and Varna and Jati meant a whole watertight system is neither historically true, nor it is something that gels with the concept of Karmavad, which is one of the fundamental concepts in Hindu thought, not just Hindu but all Indian thought as a matter of fact. And it is also something which does not match with the present day situation, in which the old classification of karmas or professions or ajivikas has undergone a big change. See, you had in earlier society a certain fixed number of professions, but when industrialization came in, then so many things changed. Then when mobility came in, migration came in, so many things further changed. And now with other technological transformations like television and first printing press, radio, television, and then the digital world, professions are very rapidly changing. So it is not possible to say that I am going to do only this kind of a profession as is prescribed. Now, even in ancient times, there were certain professions or there were certain jatis or certain categories who were neither of the four, who were not either of the four or any of the four, like the kayasthas. Now the kayasthas were the people who worked in an office. Kayen sthita iti kayastha. One who works in a kaya. Kaya means a bureaucratic office. So all these kayasthas of small and very high order, like chief superintendent of let us say the cows in the country according to Kautilya, or chief superintendent of collection of taxes from those who exported things. There were many kinds of adhikshikas or many superintendents. So all these were kayasthas, but they are the higher level ones. Then there were the middle level ones and the smaller ones, as is natural. But kayasthas were neither Brahman, nor Kshatriyas, nor Vaishya. So since very early times there have been what was called something which was born out of Varna Sankar or mixture of Varnas. So there were middle jatis or intermediary jatis or intermediary Varnas from very ancient time. Or like Suta, the charioteer. The charioteer, one who drove the chariot of a Kshatriya, was not a Kshatriya. He couldn't marry a Kshatriya's daughter. But he was also not a Shudra. And he was also not a Vaishya. So a Sut was a category by itself. And there are many categories like this. One day I plan to give a whole talk about all of them and describe them, in order to show that these were not watertight compartments. Now this is one view. The other view in India or in the West is that all Varna ashram classification as it existed was highly oppressive, it was entirely hierarchical, it was something created by the wily Brahmins. The Brahmins were manipulating everybody. So this is, the standard Wendy Doniger view and view of certain Indologists, certain lobbies of Marxists in India, and our dear friends, the Arya Samajis. The Arya Samajis also say there should be no jati, there should be no classification. Jati Vyavastha or Varna Vyavastha should be thrown out. So this is the other view. Then people in between, some people say that look, we should view Varna, Jati or caste as social capital. And some very good people have written about this. Some economics professors have written, very credible works have come out explaining. But that is, you see, although correct, but that is something that can work partially in the modern times, because it's not as if the old jatis can go on continuing. So people give example of how Gaundars, Gundars or Gaundars, I don't know how you pronounce them, in Tamil Nadu or in other parts of Karnataka, etc. They have got together and made huge industries, and there are certain other jatis and certain other professions who as social capital have progressed a lot, or people who are diamond merchants, etc. Now all this is a hangover from the past. If it continues, it's very good as far as it can continue. We should not castigate it, we should not discourage it. If people can take advantage of those links, it's very good. However, the kind of umbrella protection which was offered, let us say 400 years ago, and right back into time up to 5,000-6,000 years ago till such time, that if, let us say, if a Vaishya from North India migrated to South India, then when he lands up in South India, then people of his community would help him settle down, and start a new business and all that. Now that kind of a situation does not obtain now. It doesn't. Simply it doesn't. Now you are living in a very different world. But then this was the great advantage of Jati profession earlier. So most of that social economic order has radically undergone change, and we have to recognize that. Especially in the cases of endogamy, marriages, etc. I always take this example. Suppose if a boy and a girl, they go to a medical college, and one is a Vaishya and the other is a Brahmin. Now when they finish 5 years, after 5 years, if they want to marry, is it an intercaste marriage or is it a same caste marriage because they are both doctors? You see, if you go by Guna Karma logic, then they have spent 5 years of taking the training under the same skill, lived under the same environment and everything. So their jati or their varna is the same. So what's wrong if they marry? It's according to the spirit of the ancient system. But then people say no, because their parents are of a different jati, so there can be no marriage. So I think these issues have to be very rationally solved in India today. But then this is the situation as it obtains in India. What is the situation in terms of classification and castigation and talking about it, let us say as it is happening abroad, and what is it is exactly that is being talked about today. You see, in currently the American academics, especially of the left liberal or Marxist types, or you can now call them people belonging to the new woke culture, W-O-K-E, the wokes, wokeism, those who practice that, whatever it is. So they say that there are 3 kinds of racism in this world. One, of course, is the American racism practiced by the white supremacists against the African people who were once brought to America as slaves, freed, but still are at a very low position in society. So one is that kind of racism. The other was, as they say, the racism which was practiced by Adolf Hitler. He killed 6 million Jews, and he believed in a master race, pure race, Aryan race, etc., etc. And the third, they say, is a racism which is practiced by Hindus, because they believe in the so-called caste system. What they call caste system, what according to us is Varnashram Vyavastha. Now, what sometimes happens, and a lot is being written, is in counter to this kind of criticism, there is the thinking largely generated by our friend Baluji, what's his name, S.N. Balagangadhar, who argues that the so-called caste system is entirely creation of the Europeans, that there was no caste system in India, and it is the Britishers and the other Europeans who manufactured it, because they laid down all these castes and they made all these divisions. Now, my personal view is that while that is factually quite correct in terms of the classifications that the British made, like for instance, they said that these are fighter classes. So 6 were made into militant people. So this was a kind of a manufacturing of the caste which they did. Or so many jatis in India, they were classified as criminal tribes. So many were classified as forest tribes. And this whole classification in ethnographic terms, Jati Chitra, that you make a painting of everybody's Jati and a chart of everybody's Jati. This indeed was done by the Britishers in order to administer, in order to not just administer, but in order to give a social ranking of a different kind from the traditional one for their purposes, for their governance. Artificial system which they generated. However, that should not make us forget that a classification in terms of Varna and Jati has always existed in India. I mean, you can't go around saying that the British manufactured caste. You see, I find that a little difficult to swallow. It is true that they redefined it, and in reclassifying and redefining it, they brought in terrible distortion, and they obliterated all its upward and downward movement, all its value systems, all its association with freedom of action, all its content of dharma. All these things were simply obliterated, and only something by birth was created. As a matter of fact, this classification by the British that constrained people to follow what they were born in, you see, as had not happened earlier. Earlier there was a much greater freedom. You admitted that you were born into a particular varna, but then you had the freedom to follow other varnas. Now in the modern times, after classification by the British, because you were to be given social benefits of reservation, or what is called, there's an American term for it. I forget that term right now, but what we call in India reservation. So because affirmative action, that's right. So because you want to be a beneficiary of affirmative action or reservation, so for all your life now you stick to your caste, although socially you may not stick to many other things. Like Ambedkar married a Brahmin lady, but he himself thought of himself as a Mahar, and a Mahar turned into a Buddhist. So all these contradictions were constantly present in his life, and are present in everybody's life who is in that situation today. So I think we have to look at that also, that theory that the British created caste, there was no caste in India. That also has its limitation. Now coming back to this whole business of racism, I think we have to confront this frontally. And this is to be confronted, to my mind, by exposing the very root of racism. You see, racism is something which is entirely rooted in Christianity. And Christianity, when it became the dominant religion of the white people, that is the Western European, When Christianity was the religion of Greeks, then of course they were fanatics against the idol worshippers and against their own traditional religion in Greece, that is of the Olympic religion, Zeus, Apollo, Athena, etc. But color was not a major factor. It's only from 16th, 17th century that even Christ is made into a white person. You see, everything you imagine about Christ shows Christ as white. If you see paintings of the Byzantine period, that is 8th, 9th century AD or 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th century AD, or even earlier, if you see the paintings, Byzantine paintings done in the Byzantine Empire period, Christ is never a fair person. You know, his complexion is that of an Egyptian or a Turk or even, you know, even darker than mine maybe in the painting. But when you come to the paintings of Renaissance, Christ becomes totally a white person. So in Michelangelo and in all other great painters, etc., this is the time when Christianity becomes very aware of itself as a religion of the white people. Because this is when their colonial adventures began. And when they started defining themselves as different from the natives they saw in Africa, America, and Asia. So this is the beginning of a very clear racism. And this is the root of racism. In 19th century, several essays were written by all kinds of anthropologists who believe that the Negroes, so-called Negroes, were closer to the apes. You know, when the theory of evolution came in, then they started placing the black people closer to at the lowest level of Homo sapiens. And there is plenty of literature available on it. So it is the Christian view which fundamentally looks upon color in terms of what is pure and what is impure. You see, in the Christian chain of being, God is at the top, and God, as I said, in Renaissance becomes more or less white. Then you have the angels. Out of the angels, when Lucifer falls, then he goes to the other extreme. He goes to hell. And there he is no longer white. There he is black, as jet black, you see. And he stays there as a black person. So all devils are black or colored or dark colored. And in the chain of being, when you come down from angels, then you come to human beings. Then when you go down further, you come to birds, animals, reptiles, and then further down into those who live in hell. And the creatures of the hell right up to devil, there is a color discrimination for them. Just as in the chain of being, you are away from God and therefore you are lowly. Similarly, you are away from God who is white and therefore you are somebody low. So racism in terms of color is primarily a Christian concept. In India, nobody thought that white was beautiful. You see, some of the darkest women like Draupadi, they were considered marvelously beautiful. And I don't recall, maybe there are, but I haven't come across any 4th century or 5th century AD Sanskrit poetry in which fairness or Gaura Varna is an essential qualification of a beautiful woman. It's simply not there. I mean, you say that a woman has lavanya, madhurya, kaishiki vritti, etc., etc. All those things you talk about a beautiful woman, but it's not that you say that she is, fair. So this whole idea of the, effulgent, white, fair-skinned woman with blonde hair, golden hair, this is entirely something which was manufactured. And now, all this thing is being laid upon the Indians by way of the Aryan invasion theory, by all kinds of devious methods of talking in terms of color and classifying India, people of India, in terms of color. Of course, we have a problem in the sense that fairness cream sells a lot in India, but then this is a recent syndrome. It's not an Indian syndrome. It's only about 20 years old. So it's part of the market behavior. It's not a cultural behavior. That is one thing. The other thing that I want to talk about is that when they talk about Black Lives Matters in America, they never talk about the slavery that the black people were put to by the Arabs. You see, the Christians and the white people made slaves out of the African people centuries after the Muslims had been selling them as slaves. All slave trade was initially done by Arabs. And today you find in the North American discourse that the Islamists have the loudest voice in favor of Black Lives Matters. They castigate the Hindus as people who practice racism, and they think that Islam had no hierarchy. Now, this is one of the biggest falsehoods. Especially we know that in India. In India, the Islamic rulers were simply not bothered about the hierarchy of Hindus into Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, because they themselves had a hierarchy. Islamic society is one of the most hierarchical societies. It would take me away from the main topic if I were to give you long details. But throughout medieval period, there were three categories of Muslims in terms of caste. There was Ashraf, there was Arzal, and there was this third category, Ajlaf. So Ashraf were the people who traced their origin from somewhere in Central Asia, and they said, we are the aristocratic people who came down as warriors. Ajlaf are those who are traders, small-time money makers, converts to Islam in India, and Arzal are the working class. Until about 50 years ago in India, in a police station, when a first information report, FIR, was written on somebody, then that person's status was classified in either of these three, whether the person is Ashraf, Arzal, or Ajlaf. So Islam followed that entirely, and Islam still has that kind of hierarchy, and Islam still considers those who are Arabs and those who belong to the family of the Prophet to be much higher in social status and purity than any other Muslims. Indian Muslims are not considered to be equals in Arabia. They are considered to be much lower category people. They are not considered to be real, original, blue-blooded Muslims. Everybody knows that. So much for the North American scene. I think we should make ourselves well prepared in all these details. We should research further, and we should bring all these things into the discourse in North America. First of all, we should concentrate upon the contribution of Islam to oppression of the lower people, oppression of women, oppression of colored people, oppression of the blacks, especially the black people, because that would give a realistic picture of what's happening instead of portraying the Hindus as castes. Because people who have moved to America, they have come out of the old traditional forms of caste practices long time back. As a matter of fact, they overcame that almost a generation ago before moving to America. Or when they move to America, they don't practice the Varna system, Varna Jati system for endogamy at all. It's an entirely different situation there. So this is what I have to give you as a starter, so to speak. And now you can ask me questions about the contemporary situation. You can ask me questions about what's happening in North America, because that is a very big issue. As I said, the laws made somewhere in California or in US would once be brought into the Indian Parliament. So it's not something which is far away. Yeah.
Thank you, Bharat Gupta ji. And
Yeah.
I invite now, first I would ask Shahana ji, because she's waiting for a long time.
Yeah.
So Shahana ji, please go ahead with your first question.
Yeah, she has to go.
Thank you. Sorry, because I had to leave for
Yeah.
another appointment, so I thought I'll
Yeah.
speak first.
Yeah.
No, I don't really have questions, but I just have some observations. I think when people talk about how the British invented the caste system, I think they are referring to the distorted version that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So it's about that, when we say the British created the caste system for us, what they mean is the distorted version and also the survey, the caste census that they did,
Yeah.
and all those watertight compartments that they made.
Right.
So in that sense, I think it's very important to drive home again and again that
Yeah.
we did that. And
Right.
before that, it was very fluid and it was mobile. So that we need to keep up
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
pressure on the
Right.
on the colonizers.
Exactly.
That's one thing I want to say. And the other thing is, in America, I just thought I would talk about this because it's somewhat like what it was in ancient India. When it comes to the Neva Patels, it's very interesting that so whenever a person from that community comes to America, so that that the protective network of the Varna system is very much there for him or her. And so, to set up business or, set up the hotel, the motel business or anything, that the whole community comes together
Yeah.
and will ensure that, he has his niche. Or if his business collapses or something happens, there is a death in the family, everything goes haywire. Again, the community comes together to make it all right for this person. So,
Yes.
whatever benefits we saw in the Varna system in India, in some ways it's actually being manifested here also in America. I just thought
That's true. That's true. And Patels are a very clear example of it. But you see, as I said, that these are things which are going to undergo a transformation. And within a generation or so, they would cease to exist. You cannot count upon them as something which will be able to preserve the ancient social capital, caste as social capital. That is something which is not going to happen. You would have to manufacture very different groups now as Hindus, particularly in America, in order to provide an umbrella to the Hindu community. You see, some very different kinds of systems would have to be evolved. But you are right, the Patels have done wonders.
Yeah, and it's even today.
Yes, it
continuing.
works.
So I'm seeing that. And it's
Yes,
quite,
yes.
It looks very positive to me actually.
Yes.
Well, of course, you can take a negative view by saying that okay, the other communities
Huh.
are not being helped by them. They help their community, but then it's up to the other
No.
communities to form their own.
Yeah,
groups if they want
yeah.
to.
I
Their
don't
network
think.
of
Yeah,
research.
I don't think it's a matter of any hostility or exclusion.
Yes.
It is just a matter of asking people to join in, and people join, and that's exactly how the ancient Varna Jati Vyavastha, not Varna, the Jati Vyavastha worked, because this was the protection which was provided. Very few people changed their profession. Most of them fell into the old profession, and also the ancient system. You see, the ancient system of Jati, it provided schooling at home. You see, till the secondary level or comparable to our secondary level, there was no formal education outside home in India. Everybody learned one's trade or one's professional work at home. Whether you belong to a Brahmin Varna or a Shudra or whatever. So by the age of 12 or so, you were almost 3/4 trained in the profession. And that preserved a lot of human energy and provided so much more security. Because a person with some skill had a surviving ability, which one doesn't have even after finishing a PhD. Especially if that PhD is from Delhi University or JNU. You don't, because you are as insecure as anybody else. At the age of 30, you don't know what to do. Now, these are many things have to be seen in comparison also. Yes. Any more observations, please?
I think we have a question from Anshul Gautam.
Yes, please, Anshul.
Subharaji, the major problem with the Varna system, which the Bahujan activists say, is because of the untouchability which has been practiced since a long time in India.
Yeah.
And you also quoted that British didn't invent caste. That is also correct. I just wanted to, we have a lot of, this is going rounds in social media and everywhere.
Right.
That this untouchability came in Indian society when Mughals came, or when it was Islamic rule, and they had their toilets inside their homes and everything. So what is your view on that? And secondly, how can we overcome this part? How can we not defend it, but what is the solution to this problem where they say that untouchability was practiced, it is correct, and how can we give a solution to it?
Now, you see, the problem has to be taken care of by taking into account the real historical truth. Now, this whole business of untouchability has been blown out of proportion. What is being projected is as if every Shudra was untouchable, as if every Shudra was doing scavenging work, as if every Shudra could not enter the city, as if every Shudra was asked to wait and let anybody pass, or if his shadow fell on a Brahmin, then he was punished. See, this has become part of atrocity literature. The fact is, the truth is, that there were some people who were untouchable, like the Chandalas. Now, they were untouchable from very ancient times, not just from the Mughal times. And we are not talking of those who cleaned the feces or those who did the scavenging work. We are talking of Shudras in general. But we are talking of the Chandalas. The Chandalas, etc., they were certain jatis who for various reasons were either given a punishment to live outside the city for some crime they had done, or they were living in that kind of a system for a very long time. Then there were some people who were practicing some very strange professions, like eating rats. Now you still have those people, Musari, and they are called by. Now, people who lived in a particular lifestyle, they in any case were not part of city life or gram life. They were people who lived outside. You see, people in India have lived in the city, they have lived in villages, they have lived out in distant fields and forests, they have lived in mountains. There are people who have lived in all kinds of places. Now, to say that there should be a law of equality and equal behavior for everybody is a very modern notion. That if I am sitting down to eat, then on my table somebody who eats rats can also come and have food with me. Now this is a very, very recent notion anywhere in history of mankind. You see, when I went to the great monastery of Mount Athos in Greece, and when I was going to stay there for a week, the monk said that, look, you are not a Christian. You are not an Orthodox Christian. So you are going to sit at the lower table. It's a separate table for you. You will eat and sit there. And when a Catholic from Italy came to stay, he was also made to sit at the same table. Now these classifications, these boundaries, they were all observed in ancient times everywhere in the world. What you have done is you have taken the Hindu history, and because you want to castigate it, because you want to run it down, you do that so that eventually you can persuade these people to become Christians. And the Ambedkarites or Bahujan Samaj Party and various people, they have internalized the whole discourse. What we have done in last 50 years, we have done more to equalize people according to the notions of equality, fraternity and liberty than even the West. You see, today everybody can sit on the same seat in an Indian railway compartment. Everybody can travel in the same train. All those distinctions have been overcome, and they are not allowed under law. Now, there are of course certain sections where some very orthodox people may still be practicing discrimination. I don't deny that. But just look at the very small quantity and the number of such people. How few people are practicing that. The kind of caste conflict, or let's say the conflict between the so-called Dalits and the Thakurs, this is a modern economic battle. It's a battle not for caste distinction, but it is a battle for reservation of jobs. How many jobs are you going to give to how many people? So we have to understand that the whole thing has undergone a radical transformation. Yes, there was a hierarchy, many things existed in ancient India which cannot exist, which cannot be condoned, but then they were part of that ancient system. And this business of scavenging, as you said, it's everybody knows that in Hindu India, nobody lifted anybody else's feces because people evacuated in their backyards and they covered their feces with earth in their own backyard. If you read Manusmriti and various other texts, then that is what they prescribe. That either you go and use your backyard or you go out at the periphery of the habitation. You go into a field or whatever and then you cover your feces with earth. So all that kind of hygiene was practiced. And I don't think that was the normal thing. It's not as if 50% of Indian population were untouchables. There was a small number, yes, but it was part of the ancient system, and mostly it had a very strong relevance in terms of keeping sanitation. I mean, you had to make sanitation boundaries. So if ancient society was doing it, if it was creating those sanitation boundaries in a particular manner, I don't think we can blame them. Today we have created new sanitation boundaries after Corona. You see, we have a very different notion of sanitation now. Entirely different, which did not exist just 2 years ago. And the whole world is practicing that notion of discrimination. And people do practice that because that is the new environment. So I think within that environment people did practice it, but it is not as if everybody was, all Shudras were untouchable, all Shudras were poured with lead in their ears if they heard the Vedas. You see, some of these, about 5 or 10 things, they are constantly dished out. Constantly dished out. I'll give you sometimes an explanation as to about this whole thing. Shudra listening to Vedas, I'll give you an explanation for that also. Yeah, so next question,
Thank
please.
you, Bharatji. We have the privilege of having Dr. Conrad Elst also in the
Oh,
audience. So I
wonderful,
will
wonderful.
Ask Dr.
Yes.
Elst to ask a question.
Yes, certainly. Oh, I'm so happy to, to have him.
Yes.
How are you?
I liked hearing you say that you also think that Professor Balagangadhara's theory that it's all a British creation is a bit exaggerated.
Yeah,
Because after all, in ancient texts you already find quite a bit of caste, not in the Vedas, but soon after.
exactly.
In the Mahabharata it's already very much there.
Right.
So on the one hand, Hinduism isn't really identical with caste, which
True.
the missionaries and so on propagate, the Ambedkarites and so on. Ambedkar himself said caste is the soul of Hinduism. So that's not true. But then on the other hand, Hindus do have a burden of caste history. Well, burden that's an appreciation. I don't want to prejudge here, but at any rate, they have had something to do with caste for 2,000 or 3,000 years, which is pretty long. Not long by Indian standards, but certainly very long by, let's say, American standards. How do you see that develop in India as it is going today? I mean, some people say must have a Hindu Rashtra, we must have to go back to the past. That's not going to happen. But what do you realistically see happening?
Well, realistically, I'm very glad you're asking me. I mean, I was thought of some kind of an oddball who probably was carrying some big stigma, and most people wanted to take advantage of it. So this was the situation, let us say, in 1970. But my sons, they married across Varna on their own. They chose their wives. Their wives were their classmates. One of my daughters-in-law is a Sikh girl, and the other comes from Bihar. And she is not fair. You know, this whole business of looking for a fair wife. My son went for a dark girl. So, you know, most of these things have undergone a radical transformation today. Now, this is the good side of it. But then, there is also the bad side of it. Like some new castes have developed in India. Am I still audible, please? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, there are new castes or new jatis which are very powerful and sometimes quite obnoxious, like the IAS, Indian Administrative Officer. So one who clears the exam, he can expect a dowry of 50 lakhs or 60 lakhs. Now, so this is the new caste. Or somebody who is a successful lawyer, who has a grandfather working as a Supreme Court judge and who starts practicing at Supreme Court, that is another new caste. Somebody who is a politician and has a grandpa in, let us say, in a national political party. So, you see, the whole idea that your profession is able to provide you opportunity within the family, it is still continuing, and it is continuing very strongly in India. But you can't make a law against it. It is the natural course of things. So this is the downside of it. This is something which is making the Indian society oppressive. It's the obnoxious part of it. But then, for the large number of people, in terms of endogamy, barriers are broken. And they are broken very, very, what should I say, explosively. Then there is, of course, this abuse of caste for political voting. And this is entirely a fiction, because Yadavs have not got together and created a social capital like the Patels have done in Gujarat or in United States, or people in Tamil Nadu, the Gounders, etc. have done their good business, but various other jatis, they have not delivered positively. However, the transformation is taking place, and I think as far as endogamy is concerned, it's pretty much a matter of past in India. There are certain pockets of India in which you still have some very, very old customs, like a woman marrying 3 brothers. There are some villages in Himachal Pradesh where you still have women marrying like Draupadi. I mean, that's also part of the reality. You can't deny it. But the Indian tradition has allowed this variety. In India, the smritis were not operative for everybody and everywhere. What was called Shastrachar was operative largely in the cities and in the smaller towns. But in woods, in far off places, it was only the local custom that prevailed. It was called Lokachar, it had an official sanction, it was legal. In terms of, for purposes of marriage, for purposes of property inheritance, for punishment, for small courts, many things. But that's of course a thing of the past. Unfortunately, we have excessive uniformity now in the Indian legal system, and that itself has become a drawback. So that's what I have to say, Kyunrad. If you have more observation, I'll be very happy to hear from you. I'm very glad that you have joined in.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Bharat Gupji.
Yeah.
We have a question from the president of our university, Dr. Nagesh Bhandari.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
I think there is a network problem, so we can move ahead with other questions.
Okay,
We'll come back to him after.
okay. So the next question is from Gopakumar MP. He's asking, is there any authentic modern book that provides a difference between Varna and Jati?
Look, it's very obvious that Jati is not considered to be a unit for any legal classification in the Smritis. They only talk about Varna Ashram Dharma. They don't talk about Jati Ashram Dharma or Varna Jati Ashram Dharma. Jatis were guilds. They were economic divisions which centered around the skills. Now, the Jatis fell into a hierarchy in the Varnas. So, let us say, let's take a Brahmin. Now, a Brahmin who would be preparing food, who made his living by cooking food. There was a category of Brahmins who cooked food, and that was their profession. They would still be Brahmins, but they would be the lower category of Brahmins. So it is Brahman Varna, but the Jati of the cook, and their social status would be according to their profession as a cook. Even the person who burnt the body at the funeral pyre was called the Mahabrahmana. He was also called a Brahmana. But then that Brahman would not keep company or would have any kind of a ritual interchange with any other category of Brahmanas. You still find this kind of a gradation in terms of higher skills, higher knowledge operative today. I'll give you an example. For instance, if you take these architects, the temple architects, those traditional architects, Sompuras, etc. Now the master architects among the Sompuras, they announce themselves as Brahmins. And the sculptor who only cleans the stone, who makes it into a tablet for the finer sculpture to do artwork on it, he is considered to be of a very lower category. So there will be no intermarriage between the Brahmin Sompura and the somebody who would be at the lower end. So this kind of gradation, this kind of hierarchy has always existed. But one has to see that Jati is something that gives you a living. Your economic status is according to a Jati. And then once you have a higher status, then you can go up in the scale of Varna. The clearest example in recent history is that of Shivaji. Shivaji belonged to the land-owning class. He came from the class of land tillers. At some point, his ancestors, instead of tilling land, they took to arms. They became soldiers, and then from soldiers into generals, and Shivaji became a chieftain, and then from chieftain into an emperor. Now once he became an emperor of a region, Samrat, Then he called Gaga Bhatt, and Gaga Bhatt declared him to be a Suryavanshi Kshatriya. Some people, of course, did not accept that, but others did. Now, this kind of conflict has always been there. In the Mahabharata, Krishna was not accepted as a Kshatriya by Shishupal. Shishupal was a cousin of Krishna. But still, Shishupal did not accept Krishna as a Kshatriya. He said, no, you are a milk, one who a cow herd. You are a Gopala. You are not a Kshatriya. So you see this kind of a dynamic of people going up the ladder and people falling down the ladder, constantly operating. There were Shudra kings who became, there were Shudras who became kings. You know, Chalukyas and several others, they acquired Kshatriyahood. And it seems logical. It seems logical because if you have higher skill, if you have higher knowledge, then you can go up the ladder. At the same time, Hindu society also accepted the fact that for the highest knowledge or jnana, you can remain at the lowest social status of society and still be an enlightened person. So there are umpteen stories where a sadhu of high high upbringing or high lineage has to go to, let us say, a courtesan and take initiation and take knowledge there because the courtesan happens to be enlightened. So the possibility of a courtesan who is Varna Bahya, that is, who does not belong to either of the four Varnas. The courtesans did not belong to the Varna of Brahma, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra, they were Varna Bahyas. But still they could be enlightened. And in any case, the courtesans, the better educated courtesans were considered to be the most precious social beings in Indian society. If you read the Kama Sutra, then the wittiest, the smartest, the learned, most learned women in ancient India were courtesans. Of course, some people would not like to even hear about this, you know. I know of some politicians who have fallen out with me because I gave them this information and they thought I was denigrating Hinduism. But, you know, you can't paint a history which is not true. And as a matter of fact, this is something to be proud of, not to be ashamed of.
Thank you, Bharat. It's very interesting to know that. The next question is from Kamal, and he's asking, how do you think of Jati Varna for people who were not born Hindu but embraced Sanatana Dharma later in life?
Oh, you mean in modern times? Are you talking of this very current new phenomena, or you're talking of the ancient systems? Because many people embraced, call it Buddhism, call it Hinduism, in Central Asia and various other places, or in China and Vietnam,
Modern
etc.
times.
You're talking of modern times. I think in modern times it's a bit complicated because neither those who kind of convert to Hinduism would like to say that I now want to belong to a jati. Yes, there have been some cases. I know of a couple academics, a German academic in particular, who was denied the status of a Brahmin, and then ever since then he has been an enemy of Hinduism. Some of us can guess his name. I don't want to take his name. Anyway, but by and large, you see, people want to be accepted. And I would say that at this core, the role of the Indian Mathadhishas, those who are powerful in the Mathas, that has been rather negative, because many true devotees of Krishna are denied entrance into the Jagannath temple. I see no logic for that. And this kind of discrimination is disgraceful, to say the least. But coming to your question specifically, how would you give a Varna and Jati to those who want to convert formally? Or I wouldn't use the word convert, let's say join into Hinduism. It's a little different, because the converting or the proselytizing religions, Christianity and Islam, they have a condition that you forget what you have been, and you kind of denounce all that. You look down upon it and you denounce it. Whereas Hinduism or Hindu darshanas, they have no such demand, and logically they cannot, because karma is something you cannot denounce. Whatever you have been is your karma, and why should you denounce your karma? You are only looking forward to do different karma and better karma. So what's the point in denouncing, even if your karma has been not of the best kind? Now, I have on the net a ritual of what is called Dharma Pravesh. In 7 steps I have enumerated it as to how you can become a Hindu. You see, I start it from the 3rd step. There are 16 sanskaras for Hindus. Now the first sanskara is Garbhadhan. Anybody who is converting to Hinduism or joining Hinduism is already born, is a grown-up person. So the first or the second sanskara doesn't count. So the Namakarana sanskara is the first where you begin. Then somebody would have to give you a sanskara. Then you are given Upanayan, that is Diksha into a darshana of Hinduism. And then you are adopted by a family. Because unless you adopt yourself or you associate yourself to a Hindu family formally, you are not part of the larger Hindu fold. It is at this point that you can adopt their Varna or their Jati for whatever it is worth. So if, let's say, if I am a German who wants to convert, I come to India and I go through this process, or Paddhati as it may be called, prescribed by Acharya Bharat Gupta, if you like, and you can, become a Hindu and adopt a Varna of the family who is formally taking you into Hinduism. And then you perform your other rites till the rites of death. Because these sanskaras, they are essential to Hinduism because they are what may be called, they are steps in transformation, stages of life, and they are all biological. So there is nothing metaphysical about them. So it's at different stages of life you undergo certain sanskaras to graduate from one state, avastha, into a higher or a different one. And those sanskaras are rites, rites of passage, because you undergo a passage. So if you adopt them, then you adopt the Hindu ritual system. The Hindu ritual system is very beautiful because it makes you mentally aware of what you are doing. A ritual or sanskar means doing things with the mind, with the speech, and with the body. So you do some things as gestures, you do something as speech, and you do the same thing as a bhava or a concentration. And doing it all together is a sanskar or is a ritual. It's not mumbo jumbo or it is not an empty repetition. So that's something I thought about, and you can see it on my YouTube channel. Dharma Pravesh, it is called. It's a whole video.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's nice. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
The next question, I'll take it from Abhishek Anand because we're running out of time. So Abhishek is asking, I'm a bit confused about how important a role did karma or guna play in determining varna as compared to birth. If varna was purely karma based, then why would the concept of varna sankar even exist?
Yeah.
Varna sankar, I think.
Yes. You see, the concept
For
of
instance,
the concept of Varna Sankar is different. Varna, the theory goes that you are born into a Varna because of your activity or karmas in previous lifetime. So if you have not done very good karmas, if you have done very lowly karmas, you are born into a Shudra or a Vaishya family. I mean, this is what the theory was. There is no point in denying it and saying that no, there was no Varna Ashram Vyavastha according to birth. So it was this much part did obtain. So if somebody was born a Shudra, then he or she had no qualms in admitting that it was because of the previous lifetime karma. But that was not the end of the story. It's only the beginning. The beginning is what you do now. Now most people would follow the profession or the jati they are born into because that is not normal, that is easy, that is convenient. But there are examples, quite a few examples of how people changed. And people changed not always out of choice. They change out of misfortune. So a Kshatriya, if he lost his kingdom and if he started doing business, would come down in the Varna cycle. But coming down in the Varna cycle was still not a closed prospect, because you could go up again. If not in this lifetime, then in the next lifetime. So rebirth and karma are intertwined. There can be no concept of rebirth without karma. And there is no concept of predestination in any Hindu darshan. No Indian philosophic system depends upon predestination, that God has willed it so. There is the concept of God's will in terms of what is called his anukampa or his compassion or his great love. But that is not something which denies you your right to do whatever you please. As a matter of fact, the Gita makes it clear that Krishna says that I am not responsible for what you are getting. You yourself are responsible. Whatever you achieve out of your karma, not because I have given it to you.
Thank you. The question is from Vivek Garg. He's asking, now Shankaracharya Nishchalanand Saraswati is ready to make another column.
Is ready to
Castes common for all to make another column
Huh.
That is 5 castes common for all reconversion, as many foreigners from around the world, especially from now Latin America also, especially it's not very clear actually, I am witnessing in our ashram.
Okay, I get you.
Advait
Yeah, I
and now
understand.
Varna.
I understand what you are saying. I'll have to visit his site and listen to his lecture on this before I can comment on it. You see, I must admit that I have the highest respect for him as a scholar. He is perhaps the most learned scholar in the country today. So I have immense respect for him as a scholar. But at the same time, I think that on certain things he's a bit rigid. So, but I'll have to go through his pravachan, his lecture, before I can comment.
Okay, thank you, sir. The next question is from Sumati ji.
Yeah.
She's asking, what do you think is the future of Varna system in India? Do you see it evolving into a different form, or do you think the system will die with time? Is there any benefit in Hindus preserving the system?
Well, you see, it is evolving. I mean, what I have to say is the same as I said when our friend Kyunrad put this question to me. Kyunrad asked pretty much the same thing. So, it is evolving on its own. Look, the Varna Ashram classification has a life of its own. It is because of certain notions of cosmic order, notions of economic order, notions of diversity of life and condition in India that this thing has come into being. Those people believe that there was some very wily or some very enlightened Brahmin who sat down and wrote. Now this is not true. I would say this is nonsense, because Shastras were not written to prescribe. All Shastras, they are descriptive. That this is what happens, this is what happens, this is how people behave, this is how they practice an art, this is how they practice a science, whether it be Ayurveda or poetry or this or that. Shastras give an account of how people are creating certain disciplines and practicing those disciplines. So the same is true of society or Smriti. Now, the system is evolving, the Varna system is evolving. Of course, we don't have the same notions about purity, impurity, we don't have the same notions about what is the highest value in life, which we had, let us say, 1,000 years ago. There was this system of 4 Purusharthas, Dharma, Artha, Kam and Moksha. So Indian society is still living by them and yet not living by them. Because there are changes. For instance, today, at the age of 85, a politician living in Lutyens, Delhi would not like to give up Lutyens, Delhi. Now that's against the old ashram system of Vanaprastha and Sannyas. People should take Vanaprastha around the age of 70, 60. So people are not anxious to withdraw. That way Varna, the ashram system is under a big transformation. But then it was not practiced literally in the past either. It's not as if everybody, when he became 60, moved to the forest. So this kind of a evolution is the natural evolution, and it will go on. I would say that some of the fundamentals Hindus are not going to give up, because those are very practical things. And they are part of the social behavior and part of religious thought. And they would become very much evident as our confrontation with Islam continues. It's now that we are into a fresh confrontation and we are now assessing Islam and talking about Islam. So as this process continues, the Hindu values over a period of time would crystallize. A lot of unnecessary stuff would be shed, but the essential values would crystallize.
Thank you, Bharat Gupta. I think it's also probably important to point out, from what I believe, that when we are talking about Varna and about Jati and everything, that in Hinduism the ultimate knowledge is open to all, regardless
Yes.
of which Varna you are. And
Yes.
in fact, I was told very funny line by somebody who was a roadside kachori wala, and this is something which is very very funny, because he told me 4 lines which are very enlightening. And
Okay.
this was from a kachori wala,
Huh.
He said that in Hindi,
Huh.
Ram ki jaat Rangada, Krishna ki jaat Ahir, Brahma ki jaat Kumar, or Shiv ki jaat Fakir.
Huh. Yeah.
And I was surprised that a kachori wala is telling me this. It's very very interesting, because it shows that even a layman knows that the knowledge of the ultimate is open to all.
Yes, it is open to all, and in this, it's a very metaphorical language. You see, it's very poetic, because when Brahma is called Kumhar, then he is Vishwakarma. So whosoever wrote this particular verse or this chanda was quite a thinker. So it is something in consonance with the metaphysical values of Hindus. And you would be surprised that in India, some of the profoundest philosophic ideas are available to the common people because of the Indian arts. It is not the learned Brahmins who have taught them to people. It is not high level Sanskrit poetry, but it is the practice of theatre, the practice of stories, the practice of dances and music and songs, which have communicated Vedic knowledge or the essential principles of living to the most common people. And that's why I am a great proponent for Indian arts. That Indian arts must be pursued very seriously, because they are not only educationally very rewarding, but they are economically also very productive.
Thank you. Any other question from anybody?
Question from Mohan Naik.
Okay, Mohan. Please go ahead, Mohan. Please unmute yourself.
Namaste everyone. I don't have a question, but a request to Bharatji.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book on this topic right now, and I agree with most of what Bharat Gupta said. And I would like to talk
Excuse me, you're writing a book on what?
on the same topic, caste,
Oh.
untouchability, Indianism.
All right.
and Hindu.
Okay, I'll wait for you to publish it and then I'll go through it. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to talk to you before.
Yeah, you can give me a call. You can give me a phone call and we can discuss and we can talk.
Sure.
I'm
Thank you.
always open to these discussions, and please feel free to give me a call. Yeah.
Sure.
My telephone number is available on my website bharatgupta.com, email as well as telephone.
Sure, sir, will do.
Yeah. Certainly.
Okay.
I would like to ask one question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bharatji,
Ji.
my question is, when you are saying that Jati system is evolving and it is going to have a different shape, and that is quite visible.
Yeah.
But when we say it is evolving, we say it in reference of what Western society is today, in the sense of we'll become more modern in urbanization and all that.
Yeah.
But what we are witnessing in the West is down of the whole social fabric,
Yeah.
where family system is no longer a part.
Yeah.
Okay, their community is no longer, the reality.
True.
And as we know that, due to the immigrations and the financial bankruptcy,
Yeah.
they are going to face a huge problem.
Yeah.
And the huge problem is based on the social structure. Now, my question is,
Yeah.
will it have reality check on Western society sooner or later? And we might have revision of what is social structure and why it is important to study, understand, impact what existing. So the whole utopia thing of the West that the West that is following right now might collapse sooner or later.
Yeah.
An Indian theory of social structure might come back.
Yeah, this is, your question is pretty much that we are so all occupied with, and like Kionrad has written a lot about it, the decolonization of the Hindu mind. So it's broadly the same thing. But in practical terms, I think, the chicken have come home to roost, because in Europe and America there is a big crisis in terms of confrontation with Islam, in terms of confrontation with what may be called a new Marxism. And so that society itself is in a turmoil. And then there are other challenges of environment and resources and sustainability. So sooner or later, this kind of the model which we thought was available, this has already disappeared. And I think the serious even politicians in India are now quite aware of it, that we have to look for a very different kind of model. And in terms of sociology, we have to talk about it. Many years ago, I published a book called India Cultural Decline or Revival, in which I talked about society not in terms of social classes or linguistic groups or ethnological groupings, but I talked about 6 things: the individual, the family, the Janapad or the state, then the earth, and finally the Atma. And in between I forgot the Gram or the state or the city. So it's the individual, the family, the city, the nation, if you like to call it, Prithvi or the earth, and finally the Atma. And this is taken from Mahabharata, because this shloka is in Mahabharata. That for the sake of the family, give up the interest or the supremacy of the individual. Kularthe ekam tyajet kulasyarthe. Kulasyarthe gramam tyajet, gramarthe kulam tyajet. Then gramam tyajet janapadasyarthe atmarthe prathvim tyajet. So he says that you have to have these priorities. Not that you give up anything, but that you have a priority. So highest priority is your inner self, and your lowest priority is your body and your individual being, and then over that is the family, and then the city is larger than the family, then the nation is larger than the city, then the earth as a whole is larger than the nation, and the Atma is larger than anybody else, because satisfaction of the Atma is the highest ideal. And incidentally, that is what Manu also says, because the last 2 chapters of Manusmriti are dedicated to the placation of the highest self within you, Atma Tushti. And Atma Tushti is considered to be an element of creation. You see, wonderful thing that Manu says is that one of the elements of creation is Atma Tushti. So he thinks that that is a fundamental value of life. In social terms and in terms of your life as a biological life, it is divided into 4 purusharthas: dharma, artha, kam, moksha. But in terms of activity, it is inner activity and outer activity, social activity, aesthetic activity. All these things are brought into a interrelationship. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Ruth, if you could just expand on my previous question. So I still don't get the connection between birth and karma vis-a-vis the concept of varna. So why should society treat the marriage between a Brahmin woman and a Shudra man, or vice versa, any different than a marriage between a Brahmin man and a Brahmin woman, if the varna of the child will be based solely on his or her guna and karma? So,
Look,
and
the-
also,
yes,
it
yes.
also said that most of the education used to happen at home. So, isn't it natural to expect that since a jati is only trained in its vocation, the child will also naturally be trained in that vocation, and
Yeah.
hence jati birth plays a very important role? Yeah, thank you.
Now you're talking about modern society or ancient society? You see,
Ancient society, because
Yeah.
even some Smritis talk about how marriages between
Yeah.
different varnas are different
Yeah.
from marriages between same varnas.
exactly, because that was the most practical thing. You see, and whether you accept it or not, we have the ideal that we can marry anybody, that we have freedom to marry anybody. But in all practical terms, you marry somebody with whom the marriage is likely to be a success. And what does that success mean? It means whether you will be able to raise a family, whether you will be able to have a satisfactory mutual relationship. So, when you say that a Brahmin should be able to marry a Shudra, that's pretty much a great disparity. Even in modern terms, it's like a university professor marrying the daughter of a janitor. I mean, you can do it for love, you can do it for freedom, you can do it for Rousseau, you can do it for being a woke or whatever, but it's not something that is likely to last. So when you make rules for larger number of people to follow a behavior, then I think you have to be practical. So I see nothing wrong with that system, where you insist that don't enter into marital alliances with people who are by training, by taste, by inclination entirely different from you. See, in older societies, people lived very stationary lives. It was not the life of mobility that we have today. It was not the life of uniformity that we have today. It was something which was deeply divided along many lines, and that we have to accept. And that is something that operates even today. Now, that was their solution. I am not saying that that was the best solution, that is the solution we should go on following. I'll be the last person to say so. I think we'll have to look for solutions now in our present day society. And Smriti is something that does evolve. The very definition of Smriti is something evolutionary. It's not stationary.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from Dr. Nagesh Bhandari.
Yeah.
He's asking, when someone buys a dog or horse, we always try to see it as of highest pedigree. Then what is wrong if someone wants to select in a similar manner for marriage?
I think I pretty much gave an answer just now. You see, they when they make the ancient classifications, they did it on very practical grounds. Now most of the practical grounds have changed today. I mean, we have this uniformity of food, uniformity of education, uniformity of movement, which is very modern. So you once you take that into account, you need not follow the older system, because the purpose is not to follow a system. The purpose is to fulfill the purushartha. Life consists of fulfilling dharma, artha, kam, moksha. Life does not consist of following the category of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. You are not going to follow a social order. You are going to follow something that gives you happiness. So the social orders that give happiness would change with time. Yeah.
Thank you, Prasthutji. I think that is all for now.
Yeah. Good.
I think so, yeah.
All right then. So let me thank everybody, and